Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mastercrafted podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about Space Marines. We have one of my good buddies, Jason, coming on the show. Phil, thanks for hosting with me. Let's talk a little bit more about what people can expect today.
Yeah, so I will extend my greetings as well. Thank you for tuning in for Mastercrafted. And today we're going to talk about all things Space Marines, mainly because they've probably seen the highest uptake in terms of data slate changes. You have one of the highest player bases in the Warhammer 40k community, and also in terms of access to units, access to detachment, access to rules. You could not ask for a more diverse selection in terms of how you could play an army, what units you could take in that army. They are blessed for choice. And for someone that has maybe played a few armies like my Custodes and my Death Guard, even my GSC, that I would love to have a couple more units in, I'm definitely envious of the fact of the amount of stuff that Space Marines get access to. So we've brought on Jason as a Space Marine specialist to kind of talk us through. So Jason, why don't you just give us a little bit of a background about your Warhammer 40k experience and your competitive experience and what you're playing right now?
Hey, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so PK experience, dabbled since a kid in like fantasy and all that kind of stuff. And then when the glory days came out of 9th edition, the changeover, I'd done a couple tournaments in 8th and couldn't keep up. And then now in 9th, with the balance being where it's at, so much better. Been for the last since 9th, been pretty regularly attending tournaments and trying to climb that ladder on getting closer to the 5-1, 6-0s. But yeah.
And what are you playing right now?
I was on the Ironstorm train and trying to look around. I'm looking more into Firestorm detachment recently. I've got some ideas there, and really, I think it's just trying to find something that fits with the new options. I mean, with the new changes to Oath and where we're at with Space Marines, I think everything is kind of opened up. So I'm really trying to find something that's new and refreshing, really.
Gotcha. As you're, obviously playing around with Firestorm, it's a little bit different than some of the other detachments. But as a general overview of things people should be looking at when just building any kind of detachment, what are some of those staple Space Marine units to kind of just get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I build my Space Marine list, a big thing to take into account Space Marines is you can be some sort of a generalist, but most units in Space Marines have their job and they're not great at doing multiple jobs at once. So really what I start out with is figuring out my trash and trading pieces and what I have in my arsenal and what I want to use. So kind of down the list. Obviously, we need something to hold our back point, so I start there, and then I need something to give me space and deployment. Scouts, something that infiltrates whatever your flavor is there. Picking my trading pieces for early game. A lot of Space Marines now, it depends, but you can't stand out in the open, especially with armor content change. So being able to trade effectively, especially in an expensive codex where most of your units are quite expensive to trade, trying to figure out those pieces and how to utilize them effectively. And then right now, I think our Space Marines kind of always is trying to get the maximum efficiency out of your hammers, as I'd call them, like trying to figure out the sweet spot of point investment versus what you're going to get out of them and how long they're going to be serving you on the table. I kind of go through those steps and as far as like what I'd have for units, but in the beginning, mostly it's trying to find a game plan and a strategy based off of maybe stratagems, a new unit that, looks tempting and interesting, and then trying to build a list centered around how do I maximize that unit or that stratagem in my game plan. That is usually the kind of the go-to right now as far as just the basic, and that could be applied to any detachment in Space Marines Codex for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely something super common that I see, right? Like, I think everyone who's kind of played against Space Marines in the meta in terms of competitively have seen Company of Hero attached to Marneus, right? That's an Anvil unit. It's a great Anvil unit, right? It's incredibly tough to shift, advance in charge, fall back in charge. All those things are fantastic for that unit. You could do the same thing with an Aggressor Brick with Marneus or Inceptors, a big 6-mana Inceptors. Ben Neal took a large group of that to success. Not the Plasma Inceptors, but the Bolter Inceptors with +1 to wound and reroll hits. Believe it or not, do a lot of damage.
Absolutely.
when
Well
you're
broken.
going into pretty much anything with +1 to wound, and especially with that twin linked as well when you get those rerolls. So it is nice. Ben has done it exceptionally well. You have done it exceptionally well. Space Marines as a whole are in a fantastic spot. The one thing I would say is there are some boogeymen out there in the meta for Space Marines. So you as a Space Marine player, when you look out into the meta, is there anything that you're just like, man, I really, really do not want to see this across the table for me?
Yeah. So, first off, Space Marines are really reliant on their oath right now. So maybe even just as a game plan, something that can swamp you, stage effectively, and then you're not able to take up enough space and then hit you all at once. Space Marines can have a hard time dealing with it, especially with the Arbor Contempt change right now. And then going into utilizing and maximizing oath, you need some units that can act independently of oath and still maximize their efficiency. And, the way I look at it right now, as far as what the boogeymen are, I try to, especially with Brotmis and everything like changing really quick in the last couple months, more so I try to be effective in trying to put someone's army in an archetypical kind of construct that I can learn to deal with. And then when I'm doing my pregame questions and asking them, what's your boogeyman? What's your, stratagem that, you say you use most effectively? What are your scouts? All that kind of stuff. Trying to understand what their game plan is going to be and then being able to effectively combat that game plan. And I mean, like I said, for Space Marines right now, it seems to be the biggest downfall is the boogeyman situations are something that can just plague me for space or effectively out trade my units are usually the big boogeyman right now that I just cannot keep up in the game state, But as far as armies out there, I'd say, I don't have enough experience on the ground as far as like certain ones that would be, my boogeymen might not be your boogeymen as far as Space Marines go right now. It's more for me to combat that, understanding the archetypes and trying to develop or change my game plan according to what I'm going to be playing. And yeah, I can give examples of that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. Just because it's very hard to broadly say this is Space Marines' one problem to deal with. It all depends on what detachment you as a player are playing. A lot of the times, Ironstorm especially, I feel like, it can be very hard to deal with just bodies in mass, things that can really just throw themselves out you there, have a ton of units, and your big high damage shots just don't really get any value, and you can't really effectively take up enough space on the board. It can definitely be a problem. And there's a lot of things that, also dealing with just custodes that suddenly pop out in your face and have 2-up saves and 4-up invulns, having enough stuff that really can deal with that effectively, especially with the cover they get. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I'd say for myself, more than figuring out who the boogeyman is especially if you're, a new player or trying to figure out, a journey into mid tables and getting a little higher than that. I would say figuring out for Space Marines specifically, because of the depth of roster you have, figure out the style of army you want to play, a decent game plan, and then when I say game plan, I mean going on TTS or on your table at home, deploying that army, figuring out your sight lines on, each map, how can I effectively stage and move and take up space without losing units for no reason, and developing, this is kind of what I'm going to do in my games, irrespective of who my opponent is, this is my idea of how I want to play my game. And then if you don't know, that sets you up for if you don't know exactly what you're going to be playing against, if you ask the right questions against them, then you can kind of shift that game plan a little bit, but at least you already know what you're doing on the table. For instance, you're getting into custodes who might just, stage effectively and then push 2-up, 4-up in your face. How do I apply pressure and get myself space without letting them perfectly position their pieces the way they want to position them might be the problem you're trying to solve, but then that allows you to actually figure out, your problem you're trying to solve for your game and, chip away at that instead of trying to handle custodes as like, or any army as just the whole thing coming at you, if you're in a state that you don't know, then at least you have a game plan. This is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to try to shift a little bit, with that. And, yeah, absolutely. And I would say too, when we were talking about Space Marines, as far as the units in Space Marines, if you play with what you have too, because there's so much depth. A lot of the units take the same role. Figure out what you have and how it does those roles. Whether you have JPIs or Outriders right now, you might not be on the Outrider train, even though they're coming up. But JPIs still do that role. Figure out how to maximize the units you have in your army based on that game plan.
Yeah. You put two things in there. I think it's super important. You were like developing a game plan, asking the right questions. So for like a new player, especially at the tournament, it can be very overwhelming. I do remember my first tournament. It was just like fly by the seat of my pants, right? I was just like holding on, playing games of 40K. And at the end of the day, it was just like, oh, great. I maybe won a couple games and I'm pretty pleased with that. Now it's like, okay, we have to be prepared because you're right. We don't all have the time to play 10 games in a week or 5 games in a week or 5 games in a month.
Right,
there are people that won't get 5 games, throughout the month leading up to a tournament that they're really looking forward to. So I think you bring up a good point there. And some of those questions, I know Lane and I have talked about it at length, like some of the questions for you, our viewers, as a player who might be going to their first tournament, or maybe it's just like, this is your one game this week and you want it to be competitive, you want it to be a good one, and you want to be prepared, and you don't want to spend 3 hours doing something where you get gotcha'd, or you forget about a rule, or you didn't even realize that was a rule. So if you're asking those questions to your opponent, like, do any of your units have fights first? As a lot of my armies definitely care about that, and I definitely care if you have fights first. Do you all have fallback, advance, shoot, and charge? Right? What is the threat range of these units, especially for those advance and charge? I'm mathing it out. I'm saying, okay, you move 8 inches, you have advance and charge. So it's 8 plus 6, so 14 plus another 12. So 26 inches is your max range. Here, I'm showing you right now, I'm outside 26 inches. I don't want you charging me with advance and charge. I don't even want it to be possible. Those questions are super important. And for you as a viewer, like there are not standard questions for all the armies. Like Jason, as a Space Marine player playing Ironstorm, you probably don't necessarily care super much about fight first. It's not the biggest thing to you. You're trying to kill it on objectives, but you probably do care about like, hey, can you sticky objectives? Can I kill you and then you still have that objective? Is there any way for you to do that? Can you deep strike outside of 6 inches, or is it just normal 9? And you as a player, when you're developing your list, like those are the questions that you're already thinking about in terms of what you're going to ask your opponent. Lane as IG Imperial Guard, like his lists and the questions he's asking are completely different as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. Especially when we get to detachments, that's kind of what you're figuring out I think, first thing first, you're building a list, try to figure out, like we said, the game plan, because just like you're saying, with your game plan and where you want to position your pieces and your idea of how you want the game to go, you're going to realize the weaknesses you have, the questions you're going to need to ask. Ironstorm's a great example. Can I stick my repulsor executioners or whatever you're using, my long range guns, maybe it's ballistas, dreadnoughts, out in the open? What is your threat range of your anti-tank? Might be a question that you want to ask. Do I have to squish all my units into these small deployment boxes where they're not going to be threatened, or do I have the field? Am I going to be the aggressor in that? And that all comes from knowing what your army does, and then if you kind of run through some steps of movement, stuff like that, maybe you figure out, I'm going to have a hole in my backfield that I don't really have an answer to. What is your, like you said, what is your opponent's deep strike? Do I have to screen out for 9? Do I have to screen out for 6? What is that threat range? And so then you can effectively figure out how you're going to solve those problems as you go. But yeah, I think mostly knowing your army, knowing your game plan will lead you in the direction of asking those questions. And then I think a great one always is, what's the biggest thing that gets people in your list? What's the gotcha? Be prepared to answer it back, and be a fair player and be like, this is my lethal sustain package that's going to come out of this Vindicator, and it's going to eat whatever, you throw in front of it. That might surprise people, but that's a fair question to ask your opponent, especially if you're new. Like, hey man, I'm new. I don't really know what your army does. You said a lot in the beginning of everything it did. I didn't catch all that. What's the big thing that usually gets people? It is a fair question to ask and can help you navigate those questions in the beginning for sure.
Yeah, I think that's another strong point. And the one last thing I want to touch on before we kind of keep this moving is you're talking about going through practice deployments. I know in the last year that started becoming something that we regularly do with a lot of the lists, that you've been working on and stuff. And, as a guard player, it generally just redundancy across the board. It's not something I have to do in depth a lot. I have a lot more flexibility and just redundancy. But I mean, I feel like, we've talked many times about the value of just knowing where you need to be, knowing where you're going to go, and having that already mapped out as a more elite and, only a couple real hammers. You need to be positioned correctly, and you need to know all those things from the start, on these more elite armies like Space Marines, because if you can't get to this spot by turn 2 to threaten the next spot, you're already kind of behind, especially against armies who have, a ton of trash like a guard or Tyranids. Potentially they can just throw trash out. And if you're not able to deal with those effectively because you deployed wrong, it just automatically puts you on the back foot. And with a lower count, list, that really can just snowball. And I think that's one of the things about Space Marines and other elite armies that's just so important is knowing how to do your, deployment and turn 1 and just get staged. And really put yourself in a strong position.
Yeah, I would agree with that exactly. Like, Space Marines can be, unless you're playing Gladius or something like that, your movement can be a big issue for you. And they're not the slowest of armies, but to stage, especially some of your more effective weapons, being misdeployed or being out of position can be, for any army, can be just a nail in the coffin as far as your game goes. So, answering those questions in the beginning, yeah, being prepared or putting your stuff on the table and being like, how am I going to answer when they throw something out in the middle? Am I going to throw do I have something to trade? Or my JPIs are on the wrong side of the table. Now I have nothing to answer the center and I have to put something valuable out to answer that primary gain. Needs to be addressed before the game. A game plan of, the beginning stages of your game, turn 1, turn 2, setting you up to play turn 3 effectively, and then, letting the game go from there. I would say, yeah, getting it TTS or at home, getting those models on the table, seeing how it all plays out, seeing if your army can effectively cover your game plan,
Yeah, awesome. All right, so let's move on to detachments. We'll hit with the first one that you said you're swapping into, Firestorm. For those that aren't familiar, it's a pretty straightforward detachment in the sense that, believe it or not, it's about flamers. It's about having a little bit more adaptability with your movement, because all of the ranged weapons in your Adeptus Astartes force have the assault ability. And also, when you're within 12, you get to add 1 to the strength characteristic of that attack. So why don't you run us through what you're using to this attachment? You could just give us a quick little run through of kind of units you're looking at, what you think would be effective, and then we can press on to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to why Firestorm, and this kind of is a great example of like when building a Space Marines list, latching onto something and then trying to optimize whatever you're latching onto. For instance, you were talking about Inceptors earlier, that Inceptors right now can be a little broken as far as like the Bolter Inceptors, the amount of damage they can put out and almost into anything, just that mass firepower with +1 to wound. Why Firestorm right now is how to maximize something like an Inceptor. And when looking through, Firestorm has a neat, let's back up just a little bit. Another problem that I've been having in my Space Marine games, why I'm switching off from Ironstorm. Ironstorm's kind of a big man, has rock kind of detachment where it's trying to just outpower you. And can you handle that? I was missing movement tricks and abilities. Firestorm has in this stratagem both the things I wanted. So it has what's called rapid embarkation. The way rapid embarkation works is 1 CP, and in either fight phase, a unit that didn't disembark this turn from a transport or isn't in engagement range can re-embark or be embarked into a transport as long as they're 6 inches away. So the whole idea of that Firestorm is, throwing down, whether through Uriel Ventress, some deep striking Gravis or something like that, some heavy firepower, or Inceptors, having a repulsor behind the wall, shooting your package, not offering a trade at that point, and being able to jump back in behind the wall, through a wall, whatever, into a transport is why I'm looking at Firestorm specifically right now. Is it allows some movement shenanigans that is a new way to play the game that I think maximizes how Inceptors could be used as an answer to or a different path than Vanguard's up-down that they have, allowing Inceptors to be put down and then redeployed. But I mean, with Firestorm, you're right. Like it's has some emphasis on flamers, so you could go that route. You could look at maximizing immolation protocols, which is a 2 CP, give your torrent weapons devastating wounds. I think that in itself is a trap if you were just in a normal list. That's something, again, if that's your game plan, you need to build around it. There's some characters in Volcanistan in Salamanders gives a torrent weapon unit reroll wounds. Now all of a sudden maybe we're cooking. Maybe now we put a captain in there to reduce that CP cost by 1. We got 1 CP, throwing out flamers like crazy, and you could build a game plan off of that. But yeah, I think Firestorm's big thing is it gives you some shooting flexibility. You want to maximize shooting. If your weapons now gain assault in the detachment, it's a big clue of what am I going to put in this detachment specifically. I'm going to put a lot of things that can utilize my army rule. And then on top of that, it's got a lot of things with transports. So now we're going to add a lot of stratagem support for transports. We're going to put some transports in there. And the next thing is we're going to try to get some activation out of our unit and maybe jump back in. And then when we jump back out, we're trying to get close because that's another part of our army rule. We get that +1 strength when we're within 12 inches. I think that's the big go-tos for Firestorm, looking at utilizing your army in that way, trying to be effective in that up close, a little bit of shenanigans, but really winning against your opponent in that shooting phase and utilizing probably Oath effectively on top of that that's the long of it. That's how I build a list. Is you're looking at Inceptors, they're great right now. How do I maximize Inceptors? Well, then that's how we came to Firestorm specifically.
Yeah, I think that's a great tech piece. Being able to come in out of Deep Strike or whatever you're using, but Inceptors I think is a prime example. Being able to drop in, clear something. Now you have something that can definitely clear that chaff, and then you don't even lose it for doing so. You know, and I think that does help definitely with one of those main weaknesses of Space Marines is generally losing that trading war when it comes to chaff. This can definitely take care of some of that issue. And then the next thing, you were talking about potentially bringing in some Salamander stuff and things like that. I know you're probably planning to still do this with Ultramarines. I don't want to take away from play with what you have, to the listener and make that work. But what are some of those other cool specific tech pieces maybe that you would like to include that are Ultramarine specific?
Yeah, so going on that, the whole idea right now with the list would be coming out of Deep Strike and then embarking into a transport based on that stratagem. It doesn't mention anything about coming out of Deep Strike, right? And so Uriel Ventress is a powerhouse right now. He's giving you a Vectora. He's a welcomed addition to a Company Heroes or a Blade Guard unit. I'm looking at, additionally, there's an enhancement to give a unit ignore modifiers, which is powerful in Space Marines, especially against Space Marines. If you can punch through armor content, if you can punch through meat walls like Bolgrin or Deathwing Knights and ignore that -1 damage, sometimes that can just be a crippling piece to a unit that was supposed to be your hammer, and now it's going to be way out-traded in the center. So Uriel Ventress allows a unit to Deep Strike. It gives an infantry unit the Deep Strike keyword. So now we have another unit. Maybe we throw in Eradicators on top of that. Eradicators with, if needed, the +1 to wound on Eradicators is a tech piece that can be devastating to armor. So doing the same idea with them. Maybe turn 2, you drop in your Inceptors and you are able to jump it back into your boat. And then turn 3, you're throwing those Inceptors out of that boat. You're getting an additional 3-inch movement. You're advancing with them. You're throwing them into a backfield, maybe onto their natural point. And you're throwing a huge problem in their face, and right behind them, you throw some Eradicators onto the ground, shoot with them, throw them into the transport, a turn 4, getting ready to throw some Eradicators at someone's face is really the tech piece. So I'd say Uriel Ventress for 1, and playing around with, you could throw aggressors out of the sky. I think it's a little bit, you got to have a good game plan because, the Inceptors give you the 6-inch Deep Strike capability where you're looking at 9 inches now. And if you throw in aggressors and eradicators, you're looking at 18 inches for their range. So it gets a little tricky. You have to know exactly where you want to position those transports and where you can utilize them to be able to do something like that. But yeah, and then Phil, you touched on it. I think a touchstone of most lists right now is Marnius Calgar in a Company Heroes unit. Is, I think, through any detachment we cover, if you start the list with Marnius Calgar and Company Heroes, you're not in a bad spot at all. Like that is a tried and true method right now. That unit presents problems that are hard to solve, and especially in the right matchup, it can just be a bear. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'm done hearing about +1 strength and all this cool stuff from Firestorm. It sounds great. It sounds awesome. I'm so happy for you that you have another cool detachment that you can use.
Yeah.
Gladius, not enough. Ironstorm, not enough. Firestorm, right? Firestorm, you got 3. The rest of them, they got to be bad, right? Like all the other detachments got to be bad.
Yeah, I would say it's a hard time to be a Space Marine player. You don't have any options right now. Yeah. What's your next one you want to look over? Pick a bad one. And
I want to go over Anvil Siege Force.
Anvil Siege Force.
Yes, the reason I want to go over it, for those that watched our previous episode, we all went to LVO, and my last game was into Ben Jones, a Vanguard Tactics, great dude. It was probably my best game of the event. He's just a great person to play against. It was a very close 1-point loss that I was unable to squeak out, and he stopped me from going 5-1. So I will hold that against him forever. But it was a great game, and I really enjoyed it. And he was running Anvil Siege Force with Desolation Marines and Vindicators, and obviously Marnius Calgar with not a Company of Heroes, but a big aggressor brick. So that was a completely different list in terms of what I've seen in the past. But it was very, very interesting in terms of how he was able to handle it, because he's an incredible player, and then kind of what the tools are in that detachment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is just a great example. I remember you talking about that list. A great example of he had an idea, a game plan that he wanted to do, and he went all in on it, right? Because you said he uses Desolation Marines to maximum efficiency, trying to maximize Desolation Marines, it sounded like.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, so the tech piece there would be Anvil. When you stand still, you get all sorts of additional benefits. You got the stratagem. I'm slipping the name right now of the stratagem itself, but it gives you crit hits on 5s and sustain as long as your unit stood still. So Desolation Marines are
Battle Drill Recall.
Battle Drill Recall. I'm sure you start to hate him saying that by the end of the game. Yeah,
that wasn't the main stratagem he used, believe it or not. That was
really
that was not the main issue in terms of what he was able to do. I'll talk about it after, but keep going. And just so everyone understands, it's if all of your Adeptus Astartes models have the heavy ability, and if you already have the heavy ability and you remain stationary, you get +1 to wound. So that is the detachment rule for Anvil.
Yes. Yeah. And then on top of it, it's a detachment that deceptively, what it says is that you need to stand still. But I think really the way Anvil plays is it's a cool bonus if you get it. But a lot of times that's not really why you're teching into Anvil Siege Force. And in no way in Warhammer's a movement-based game, and it's trying to take up space on the battlefield effectively. And so standing still usually is not the right answer with your pieces. But there are a lot of tricks in Anvil that can effectively get you into position correctly. I think it's not 1 step backwards. Yeah. Nope. That's the one where, you can double your OC.
Double OC.
Yeah. Where is it where you can, is it rigid discipline? You can disengage from a unit in the fight phase. Yeah. And
correct.
Get a movement. Yeah. So that's the tricks we're talking about is, I don't know, was he running the, with aggressors, and then he's got a Biologus, and they've got, ignores cover. Yeah, with Architect of War, I'm pretty sure.
I'm pretty sure,
yeah. So he's got Architect of War. He's ignores cover, AP1, a bajillion shots coming out of these aggressors. +1 to wound is insane on top of that. Let's say you are on an objective, you chew through that unit, and maybe Calgar punched something in the beginning of the game. He turns on that Biologus. He gives it OC 9, and then you kill most of the unit, you kill all the aggressors. He starts taking, wounds on the Victrix Guard. You're still trying to chew through Calgar. but that Biologus is still living there. Well, on his turn, he can double the OC of that Biologus and turn it to OC 18 now that it's standing on an objective and flip that objective back in his favor. Yeah, that's the kind of shenanigans you're looking for in Anvil. I think Anvil answers the problem that Space Marines have a lot. There's been some changes to help it, but OC is a problem for Space Marines. There's a lot of times you don't even want. One of the weaknesses of Space Marines is someone can just not engage you. And if you're not effective at taking up space, but can just move things onto objective, you're going to lose that on primary because they'll just out OC you easily. Like, we don't have a lot of pieces that have a high OC, and it's somewhat of a tax, or has been in the past, of getting OC into our list. So Anvil very effectively answers that question of how am I going to hold OC, or how am I going to hold primary, and has a lot of tricks for that. Anything else you'd like to know about Anvil? I'd like to know. What was the surprising thing? What was, if you walked up to the table and you asked Ben, what's the thing that catches people off guard with this list? What would he probably have said?
I would say the double OC is probably a big one. And then the fallback and out of disengagement range. But the one thing with that is it's got to be back inside his deployment zone or on an objective. So in terms of how you stage that, it is super important. But all the other stuff, I think is pretty straightforward. Now, I was running GSC at this tournament, and I can say with utter confidence, we do not like Desolation Marines killing all my gargoyles, 10-mans, everything that's toughness 4, toughness 3. Like, I had to play incredibly different in that matchup because it is the first time at OVO that I've had just that amount of indirect fire with just that one unit of Desolation Marines with the reroll hits and +1 to wound. Like, it just made a huge difference, right, in terms of how I played the game. And even though I feel like I pushed it to the absolute limit in terms of, like, I was trying to take his primaries away and forcing him to spend CP and forcing him to do all those things, and denying secondaries, right? Like, I did as much as I could in terms of maintaining that game, and it came down to a dice roll, and I couldn't ask for a tighter game. So I've learned enough about Anvil. I'm good. I don't want to see it again, unless I'm running Custodes. If I'm running Custodes, then sure, shoot at me with your Desolation Marines. I don't really care.
Yeah. There's a lot of matchups that wouldn't have been, and you could still plink wounds off, especially with that many saves, sometimes into those armies. Trying to just get them to take saves is the answer. But I did want to touch on really quick. I think you mentioned to me, it was a great example of him having a game plan and sticking to it. Anvil's a great example of that. You asked him if correct me if I'm wrong, but you asked him after the game that, why did you include 2 units of infiltrators on top? One wasn't enough. And he said, well, I'm so point invested into my Desolation Marines, I can't let you get behind my wall of Anvil Siege Force. And I'd imagine the way that would play, if you were making, theoretically, you're developing a list like that, you're putting pressure on your opponent. You can't hide from me. You need to come to me. I need to put pressure on you so I can get all my cool tricks and abilities. I want to be somewhere near my deployment zone or objectives to get the full efficacy out of my stratagems. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to put pressure on you. You're not going to be able to get behind me because of my infiltrators. And now you have to walk out against my wall of Space Marines that are hyper effective now. Yeah, I think it's a great example of how to build a list and have a game plan and then execute it. Know how to design a list for that.
Yeah, I think that is a final little thing to note about that, and it does make a lot of sense to now bring 2 infiltrators. Like, I never would have thought of that had we been, maybe workshopping an Anvil list. But now I think let's move on to Ironstorm. As an armor loving player myself, I'm always stoked to hear about what kind of armor you're going to roll onto the table playing some Ironstorm Spearhead. And, to quickly give listeners, what that entails as a detachment rule. Once per phase, each Adeptus Astartes unit in your army can reroll a hit roll, wound roll, or 1 damage roll made for that unit. And that is not limited to specifically vehicles. That is just every unit in your army.
Yeah, absolutely. Which includes Gilliman. You miss once with Gilliman, I can go ahead and turn that one into something else, hopefully. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reason Ironstorm is really popping off right now is we have a lot of cheap and effective units that are available to take full advantage of that rule and take full advantage of the strategy support available. So I'll say, I think a lot of Ironstorm right now is running Vindicators and Ballistic Dreadnoughts en masse There's a lot of 2-up saves that put out some pretty hefty punches. But Ironstorm in general, if it was other than that, it's got a lot of, it's obviously vehicle focused. A lot of its stratagem support is going to be directed towards vehicles. It's big strat that if somebody were to ask me, like I mentioned before, what's going to be a surprise, it's got a strat called Mercy is Weakness that gives one vehicle crit hits on 5s and sustained hits. The caveat with that is that whatever it's shooting at needs to be under its starting strength. Just have 1 wound plinked off. But that can, obviously almost double, especially with Oath and something like a Vindicator. Vindicator now is going to be wounding anything on the game on 2s. It's going to be pumping out D6 plus 3 shots, full rerolls, trying to hit 5s and 6s. On top of that, there's most of the enhancements in the Ironstorm Spearhead are directed towards Tech Marines. There's a lot of encouragement to bring Tech Marines in your list. So you could just, on top of that, even if it didn't have an enhancement, give that Vindicator +1 to hit through a Tech Marine. And now you're hitting on 2s, fishing for 5s and 6s, sustained hits, wounding on 2s. Oh, and you dropped 1, so I can use my Ironstorm reroll to roll that 1 into hopefully a 2. And just eat anything on the table. And that's going to be Ironstorm in a nutshell. It's going to try to maximize its damage output. And then on top of it, usually Ironstorm lists are skewing into, I've got so much 2-up save potential. Can you handle it? Can you punch through my armor more effectively than I can punch through yours? And usually I've had one player comment that I just got outshot by Ultramarines and I'm playing Tau. Like Ironstorm's going to shoot you off the table if you allow it. Yeah, and I mean, other than that, that's Ironstorm in a nutshell. And it has, I would say, it's big one that if you can get it to pop off, to look out for as a Space Marine player. Do not forget about it. It has another stratagem that isn't quite as obvious in the beginning. Let me see, not vengeful. I think it's Unbowed Conviction. Mm-hmm. Yep. So again, you're allowing your whatever Vindicator, Repulsor, Executioner. What Unbowed Conviction does is you target one of your Adeptus Astartes units, could be Gilliman if you want, and then until the end of the turn, your unit can ignore any or all modifiers to its characteristics or any roll or test made for it. This is going to punch through Armor Contempt. This is going to punch through anything that's going to half your damage or -1 damage. The caveat is you need to be below starting strength. Some tricks in that is you can, if your vehicles are D3 explosion, if they, what is it called?
Deadly Demise.
Deadly Demise, thank you. Explosions is usually the term. Yeah, if you Deadly Demise D3, you can blow up a vehicle. You need it, and this takes a little bit of forethought. You can blow up your own vehicle in your lines to just take your 1 or 2 wounds off of your Repulsor Executioner or your next Vindicator that's going to come up into the slot. And now this one, Smoke's not going to matter. Armor Contempt's not going to matter. -1's not going to matter. Like this one's going to shoot even more effectively, even though it's down 1 or 2 wounds.
And as being on the receiving end of this, you as listeners need to know how much this hurts. As a Dorn running player who can blank 8 damage, and he just lingers this little Invictor Warsuit out right, just outside of 6 inches or just inside of 6 inches from a repulsor. I kill it. He blows it up just for that. And then I have a Dorn in the open that is going to get shot by a repulsor. It does it. I can't blanket damage. I can't smoke. There's nothing I can do about it besides force him to spend the CP for this and still just get blown off the table by a nice wounded repulsor. So it definitely takes some forethought, but that combination is worth keeping in the playbook if you run Ironstorm.
For those that aren't aware, the stratagem they're talking about is not just Deadly Demise. Deadly Demise is when it dies. Vengeful Animus is the Ironstorm strat that allows you to self-destruct yourself.
Yes. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Correct, yeah. So you could layer it, like they're saying. You could layer it with, I'm going to trigger this. I'm going to now have access to ignore mods for a CP. It is a little bit CP intensive, but when you have Gilliman and Martius on the field, Ironstorm doesn't necessarily struggle with CP generation, do they, Jason?
No, not at all. And that's that's the other thing with Ironstorm right now is a lot. I was running Ironstorm in other list configurations, but a big thing, most people ignore all the fancy enhancements that you can put onto your Tech Marines or your other characters. But the big one you want to be aware of, your weakness in Ironstorm is going to be your movement. You need to be positioned correctly because there's only one way to, well, technically two if we include Marnius. but one way to get yourself out of a sticky position, and that is Master Machine War Enhancement. That's going to allow whatever character you put it on to pick a vehicle within 6 and allow them to fall out of combat and shoot and behave normally, or advance and shoot. And that's going to be something you're going to need to leverage and utilize effectively when playing Ironstorm, is positioning of your tanks. And because you can traffic jam yourself very easily with these big tanks, and not letting someone bind you up and just, throw a Chimera in your face, tag a Rep X and say, hey, you can shoot my Chimera if you want, or you can shoot out, or you can move this turn, but you have to pick. And that's going to be the big thing in Ironstorm, is what I was getting to. Is you got to realize your movement is going to be limited. One answer for that can always be Marnius Calgar. His movement flexibility and his CP generation in a detachment that has high demand of CP. He's going to be almost an auto include for that. And then you can additionally layer on Gilliman if you're feeling spicy, and play with your 30 CP throughout the game or whatever it turns out to be. Yeah. Pretty spicy.
And that's exactly what, Ironstorm really needs with all that firepower, is a second oath target. Really just seems like the way to go. Is, you're not going to have an easy time killing everything that steps out. You better take, a second oath target as an option with Gilliman.
Yeah, and I would say, speaking about that, if you're running 2 oaths, and your difficulty of your list is movement, look into the Inceptors, Bolter Inceptors, maybe a 6-man, maybe 2 3-mans, but they're going to give you that extra movement you need to get to tough spots and targets, and it could just be your second oath target that you could just blow up for no reason, which is pretty cool. Cool little tricks like that are available to Space Marines right now. Never a bad tech piece, even though it isn't a vehicle. You're still you're covering one of your weaknesses through that. You're answering one of your questions of, I can't peek around corners too well. Well, I've got 6-inch deep strike with just an ass load of shots now. So yeah, solves that problem pretty quickly. Yeah, absolutely. Want to be done with Ironstorm now? On to the next one. Unless we have any more questions about it, for sure.
No. I don't need to hear anything more about Ironstorm until Ironstorm's dead. Oath moment is back the way it was, and we never have to worry about it again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just hoping they at least, I had to take the hit of Demolishers going to D6 +1 shots. I would be just fine if Vindicators got the same treatment, especially with the current way the oath is set up.
Oh yeah, brutal.
Right,
what's next?
Yeah, do you want to go over one more detachment, or we can give it for a part 2 because we're already at 48 minutes.
Oh shoot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. I think Gladius and Vanguard would both be worthy inclusions. I'm more than happy to maybe give this a break and just pick maybe, Librarius Conclave as a third to go over on another day. I think those 3 would also make a great part 2. And, we try to keep it tight, but Space Marines just have so much shit to go over, man. Holy cow.
I will say I did play in the Librarius at LVO as well. So I played Librarius and Anvil.
Nice.
For my Space Marines, and then I played ACDC Space Marines, or Chaos Space Marines, and then normal Chaos Space Marines as well.
Nice.
So I had a well-rounded LVO experience of power armor. So that's what we got.
Absolutely.
People want to play power armor, I give them power armor.
Yeah. I think that would be the great thing to touch on with Space Marines right now, is there's so much depth. You've got great detachments, maybe other than First Company. If you can find a way, and you're a detachment specialist and you found a way to use First Company's task force effectively, and you've developed a game plan and you know what you're going to do, hey, maybe there's some legs there. But that's what I would say to anyone, especially if you're a beginning player or moving to the mid tables. Space Marines themselves are an army that not necessarily beginner friendly. You need to know a lot about the game. You need to know how to trade effectively and how to deploy effectively, or you can get caught out. So run what you have. Most anything in Space Marines right now can be played and is a decent data sheet. Run what you have, make a game plan, figure out how to use your pieces effectively, and use your detachment you selected effectively based on your game plan. And you don't need to follow the meta really at all right now. I'd say the biggest thing with Space Marines is not what the Space Marine player has in their list. That can be answered easily by most armies. It's how the Space Marine player plays it. I think that's pretty true for most armies, but very true for Space Marines. Space Marines is pretty easy army to understand, but really hard army to master and play effectively. So don't worry about what units you have. Worry about how you made your list, how you plan to run it, and then become a master at running your list. You're going to be much more effective than if you had the correct pieces or the dream pieces you want. That a lot of times is not going to solve your problems in Space Marines, I would say. I think it's learning what you have and how to run it, because Space Marines are blessed right now. They have all the choices in the world. And
Yeah,
you've got 4 data sheets that are going to do the exact same job. Maybe it's 5% less efficient, but it's still efficient for sure.
Yeah, I will say with the shakeups between some of the changes to those data sheets and then Oath itself, I mean, under the right detachment, it really has just turned trash to treasure for some of these units that just nobody was taking before that.
Absolutely.
And stuff. And so that's great for, some of the newer players just getting going. You now can use some of those things and not be like, oh man, like I can't take this to a tournament. You definitely can just, use some of this stuff we've talked about and are going to go over, next time. And you can really make things work for you in Space Marines right now, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, Jason, thank you so much for coming on. That was a great initial conversation about Space Marines, and it makes me envious every single time of, man, do I have it in me to paint another army and paint some Space
Paint 'em
Marines?
up. Join the club.
Yeah, my G-Star cult are done. My Custodians are done. My Death Guard are done. Is it time to paint some Space Marines? But I don't know about that.
Join the Vanilla Bean faction, man. It's great over here.
Yeah, and I mean, even just to throw it out there, Jason here, he is the G-Man simp. He is one of the hardest, Ultramarine just to the core players. He even his Dark Angels are Ultramarine.
Absolutely.
You gotta if you commit to the Space Marines, you do it wholeheartedly.
Yeah,
absolutely. Join the club.
All right, yeah. I think that's a great place to leave off for this episode, and we'll see you guys back here at the Forge with Mastercrafted on the next one. Phil, any final thoughts?
No, we're just getting ready for our next tournament. We have a couple big ones coming up. So Lane and Jason, are you coming down as well
next weekend?
Yeah.
I'll be
playing a little bit of Garage Hammer down here in the Springs. It's going to be a great time, and I have some special surprises just for them. That way, when we get paired together, they're gonna learn about the cult in a new way.
All right,
I'm going to bring these guys down here. We'll definitely have a little bit of a recap after we all play down here in Colorado Springs. So other than that, that's it for us. And don't forget, victory isn't given; it's forged. Thanks, guys.
Hey, thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.